I had always thought of myself as the kind of mother who could keep her world and her daughter's world separate, loving her from a respectful distance once she was grown, but never intruding. She had her own life, her own family, her own decisions to make, and I was content to be the steady figure in the background. Still, being a mother means your heart is never far away, no matter how old your children become. That's why the moment I realized I had forgotten my reading glasses at her house, a simple mistake after Sunday dinner, turned into something that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my daughter's marriage, her choices, and even about myself. It had been a warm evening, one of those comfortable gatherings where the smell of roasted chicken filled her cozy kitchen and laughter echoed off the walls as the kids ran around. My daughter had inherited her father's easy smile and my tendency to over-prepare meals, which meant her table was always overflowing with too many side dishes. Her husband sat at the head of the table, pouring wine, raising toasts, slipping jokes that made everyone chuckle. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a perfect family picture. To me, it was comfort mixed with a hint of distance. I'd learned over the years that what looks perfect often hides deeper shadows, though I tried not to pry unless she invited me in. When I finally left that night, hugging her and the grandkids, I felt a kind of lightness in my chest. It was enough to see her happy, to watch the children thrive, to hear the easy laughter at her table. Driving home, I didn't even realize I had left my glasses sitting on the small end table beside the sofa, where I'd been flipping through her magazines. I only noticed when I sat down with my book later that night and the words blurred into meaningless shapes. I could have waited until the next day, but something tugged at me, a small insistence that I should go back right then. The drive wasn't long. Just 15 minutes of winding streets and quiet neighborhoods. The air smelled of summer grass and distant barbecues, and I remember telling myself that I would slip in quietly, retrieve my glasses, and leave without disturbing anyone. But as I pulled up, I noticed the house was still lit, far more than I expected for the late hour. The curtains were drawn in the living room, but light spilled through the gaps, and faint voices carried into the night. At first, I hesitated. It felt wrong to walk in unannounced, even though I knew she would never begrudge me. Still, I didn't want to intrude if they were in the middle of something private. My hand hovered over the doorbell, then pulled back. That's when I heard it, a sharp tone, not loud enough to be shouting, but with a weight that froze me where I stood. Her husband's voice. Low, firm, the kind of controlled anger that sent a chill down my spine. I leaned closer to the door, telling myself I would knock any second, but the words drifted out clear enough to make my chest tighten. He was accusing her, his words sharp with contempt, calling her careless, ungrateful, selfish. I couldn't make sense of it at first, because only hours earlier he had been all smiles and jokes. Now, his voice dripped with venom I had never heard before. My daughter's reply came soft, shaky, like someone who had repeated the same defense too many times and no longer believed it herself. She tried to explain, to soothe him, to calm the storm, but he cut her off, his voice rising. My hand pressed against the doorframe, and I felt my pulse thundering in my ears. Something inside me wanted to burst in, to demand answers, but another part told me to stay still, to listen, to understand before acting. Then I heard it, the sound of something breaking, glass shattering against a wall or the floor. My body stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. My daughter gasped, and the silence that followed was worse than the argument itself. A silence heavy with fear, the kind that pressed into the skin and made your heart ache. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. I shouldn't be hearing this. I shouldn't be standing outside her home like a thief in the night, gathering pieces of her private pain. But every instinct in me as a mother screamed not to leave, not to walk away. I had to know if she was safe. As I stood frozen, the voices resumed. His tone softened suddenly, turning coaxing, manipulative, as if trying to erase the violence of a moment ago. He told her she was overreacting, that it was just stress, that she drove him to frustration, that she should be grateful for everything he did. The words made my stomach turn, because I had heard similar excuses long ago in my own youth, words I had promised myself my daughter would never have to endure. I had left her in the care of a man I thought would protect her, cherish her. But now I was hearing the truth behind the charming smiles, the polite dinners, the well-practiced jokes. It was a truth she had hidden, maybe even from herself, and it took me forgetting a simple pair of glasses to stumble into it. I didn't know how long I stood there, gripping the doorknob, torn between bursting in and retreating into denial. My mind swirled with memories, with all the little moments that suddenly made sense, the faint tiredness in her smile, the way she sometimes glanced at him before speaking, the slight hesitation when she invited me over. All of it painted a picture I had refused to see until that moment. Finally, I forced myself to step away, to walk back to my car with my heart in pieces. I couldn't let her know I had overheard. Not yet. If I confronted her now, she might retreat further into silence, or worse, he might punish her for my intrusion. I told myself I would find a way, a careful way, to reach her, to help her see that she didn't have to face this alone. But that night, as I drove home with my glasses still forgotten, I felt the weight of helplessness pressing harder than ever before. I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house seemed louder, every shadow heavier. I thought about calling her, about inventing an excuse to come back. But fear rooted me in place. Fear that if I pushed too hard, I would lose her trust. Fear that I was too late, that she was already too far trapped in something she couldn't escape. And beneath it all, fear that the strength I once carried as a mother had faded, leaving me unsure of how to save her without breaking her world apart. The night stretched endlessly, and by morning, I had resolved one thing: I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard. But I also knew that this would not be as simple as showing up at her door with concern. This was a delicate balance of truth, timing, and love, and one wrong move could drive her deeper into the shadows. I had always believed my role as a mother was to step back once she was grown, to let her walk her own path. But now, standing at the edge of her hidden pain, I realized some paths are too dangerous to walk alone, and no matter how old she was, she would always be my child. That was the night my world shifted. A forgotten pair of glasses had shown me the cracks beneath the surface, and I knew my life and hers would never be the same again. The next morning, I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had happened. But every sound, every quiet moment dragged me back to that doorstep. My hands shook as I brewed coffee, and the taste was bitter on my tongue, though I'd used the same beans I always did. The newspaper blurred without my glasses, yet I didn't care to fetch the spare pair hidden in my nightstand. My mind was too full, heavy with images of my daughter's trembling voice and the sharp edge in her husband's tone. I debated endlessly whether to call her, to casually mention my glasses, and slip in a question about how her evening had ended. But I stopped myself every time I reached for the phone. If he answered, what would I say? And even if she picked up, what if he was listening? I remembered the way she had always been careful with her words around him. Not obvious enough to alarm me then, but now glaring in my memory. I couldn't risk putting her in danger just because I was desperate for reassurance. So instead, I waited. I waited through the restless hours of the day until finally, in the late afternoon, she called me. Her voice was bright, practiced, the kind of cheerfulness you learn to put on like makeup. She apologized for not returning my call from the night before, told me she had found my glasses, and asked if she could drop them off on her way to the store. My heart leapt at the offer. She was giving me an opening, whether she knew it or not. When she arrived, I made tea, set out her favorite biscuits, and tried to keep my voice steady. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, but her smile was as radiant as ever. The children were at home with their father, she explained, and she had only a short window before needing to get back. I wanted to reach across the table and beg her to tell me the truth, to pour out everything she was hiding, but I could feel the invisible walls she had built. So instead, I asked gentle questions: how she was sleeping, if work had been stressful, if the children were giving her a hard time. She answered quickly, smoothly, as though she had rehearsed these responses many times before. Finally, I said it. Sweetheart, I worry about you. Are you truly happy? My voice cracked despite my best effort, and she froze, her smile faltering. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes: fear, longing, exhaustion. I couldn't tell, but then she laughed softly, shaking her head. She insisted she was fine, that marriage was just stressful sometimes, that every couple argued. She brushed it away like dust on a windowsill, but I knew the weight behind her words, because I had once spoken the same ones. When she left, hugging me tightly and promising to call soon, I felt both closer to her and further away. She hadn't admitted anything, but she hadn't denied it convincingly either. That night on her doorstep had confirmed what my mother's intuition had suspected for years, and I was left with the painful truth she wasn't ready to tell me. Over the next weeks, I tried to find small ways to stay present in her life without smothering her. I offered to babysit more often, invited her on errands, sent her little messages in the morning. At times, I glimpsed cracks in her facade. Once, when I picked up the children, I noticed a bruise on her wrist, faint but unmistakable. She quickly tugged down her sleeve when she caught me looking, muttering something about bumping into the cupboard. Another time, I saw how she flinched slightly when her husband's voice boomed from another room, even though his words were light-hearted. Each sign tore at me, but still, I hesitated to confront her outright. I remembered too vividly how easy it is to retreat into denial when someone forces you to see what you're not ready to face. I needed her to come to me willingly, to know that she had my unconditional support when she was ready. Then came the night that changed everything. I had agreed to watch the children while she attended a work function with her husband. The kids fell asleep quickly, their small bodies curled under blankets. Their innocence, a painful contrast to the storm I suspected brewed between their parents. I tidied the kitchen, folded laundry, anything to distract my restless mind. When they returned, it was late, and I was about to leave when I heard the sharpness in his voice again. It was different this time, slurred, edged with alcohol. He snapped at her for forgetting his jacket, for speaking too long with a colleague, for making him look bad. I froze in the hallway, clutching my bag as he berated her with words laced in cruelty. My daughter's replies were hushed, desperate. The same fragile tone I had heard that night outside their door. And then, for the first time, I saw it with my own eyes. His hand shot out, gripping her arm so hard she winced, and he shook her as though she were a rag doll. It was over in a flash. He let go when he saw me standing there, but that brief moment carved itself into my memory with a permanence that still makes my stomach clench. Our eyes met. His expression shifted instantly, a mask sliding into place. He smiled, apologized for being clumsy, claimed he was just tired. My daughter's face flushed, and she murmured agreement, refusing to meet my gaze. I wanted to scream, to grab her and pull her out of that house. But she silently begged me with her eyes to stay quiet. For the sake of the children, for the sake of peace. I drove home that night with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I knew now that I could not simply wait for her to come to me. Time was no longer a luxury. Each day she stayed in that house was another day she risked harm, another day her children absorbed the silent lessons of fear. I had to act, even if it meant risking her anger, even if it meant tearing apart the fragile peace she clung to. I spent sleepless nights researching, calling discreet hotlines, speaking to counselors who explained how cycles of abuse tighten like ropes, convincing victims they cannot escape. I learned that leaving was the most dangerous time of all, that abusers escalated when they sensed their control slipping. I learned how carefully I would need to tread, how vital it was to have a plan, to build a safety net strong enough to catch her and the children. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed courage, the kind I hadn't summoned in decades. I thought of my own past, of the nights I had endured raised voices and slammed doors before finally finding the strength to walk away. I had sworn my daughter would never live the same nightmare. Yet here she was, replaying the echoes of my past, and I felt both guilt and fury burning inside me. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, while her husband was away on a business trip, she arrived at my house with the children, her eyes swollen from crying. She tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but I couldn't hold back any longer. I took her hands in mine and said softly, "I know. You don't have to hide it anymore." For a long moment, she stared at me, her lips trembling. Then the dam broke. She sobbed into my arms, words spilling out in gasps and fragments. The insults, the control, the bruises, the endless cycle of apologies and false promises. She told me she had been ashamed, convinced it was her fault, terrified of what would happen if she left. She admitted she had thought about running, but fear always pulled her back. I held her tightly, tears streaming down my own face. At last, the truth was no longer hidden between us. At last, we could begin to plan, together. Once the words had left her lips, there was no putting them back. The dam had burst, and in its wake came a flood of pain and confession that shook us both. I listened without interrupting, letting her release years of secrets she had held close to her chest. Each revelation landed like a blow: the times he had mocked her in front of the children, the times he had controlled the money so tightly she couldn't buy groceries without permission, the times he had raised his hand but stopped just short of leaving visible marks. And then there were the apologies, lavish flowers, promises of change, tender whispers that pulled her back into believing he could be different. The cycle was textbook, the very pattern I had studied in those sleepless nights. But hearing it in her voice, seeing it etched into the lines of her face, made it raw and real in a way no research ever could. She wasn't just any woman caught in the web of abuse, she was my daughter. My little girl who used to braid her doll's hair, who once came running to me after scraping her knee, who trusted me to protect her. And now, she was the one wounded, trapped, believing she had nowhere safe to turn. I told her what I had learned about shelters, about restraining orders, about the quiet network of support that existed for women in her position. I explained how carefully we would need to plan, how we couldn't act rashly, how every step had to be measured to protect her and the children. She nodded through tears, absorbing the information like a lifeline. But then, as if rehearsed, she shook her head and whispered, "He'll find us. He always finds me." Fear was his greatest weapon, and it had burrowed so deeply into her that even imagining freedom seemed impossible. I felt a surge of anger, not at her, never at her, but at the man who had stripped away her confidence until she doubted her own right to safety. I pressed her hands tighter and said, "You won't be alone. I will stand with you. Whatever it takes, we'll make sure you and the children are safe." The days that followed were a blur of secret preparation. She began quietly gathering important documents, birth certificates, bank records, anything that would help her rebuild her life. I offered to store them at my house, hidden away from his watchful eyes. We talked in hushed tones on late-night phone calls, using code words if we sensed he might be nearby. The children, blissfully unaware, thought they were playing games when we asked them to practice special sleepovers at Grandma's house, never knowing these rehearsals were part of an escape plan. But even with planning, the fear never lifted. Every time her phone buzzed with a message from him, she flinched. Every time a car pulled into my street at night, I felt my chest tighten. We lived in constant anticipation of the moment when our fragile secrecy would shatter. And yet, alongside the fear, I also felt something else returning, a fierce determination I hadn't felt since my younger years. I was a mother again, in the most primal sense, fighting to protect my child with every ounce of strength I had. The breaking point came sooner than either of us had expected. One evening, she showed up at my door with the children, her face pale and eyes wide. He had discovered the missing documents. He hadn't confronted her directly. Not yet. But she could tell from his questions, from the tension in his voice, that he suspected something. "I can't go back tonight," she whispered, her voice shaking. Not after the way he looked at me. I ushered her inside, my mind already racing through the plan we had rehearsed. This was it, the moment we had dreaded and prepared for. I called the hotline we had been given, and within an hour, a counselor was speaking to her on the phone, guiding her through the next steps. Arrangements were made for a safe house, a place where he couldn't reach her. She clutched my hand the entire time, trembling but resolute. For the first time in years, she was making a choice for herself, for her children. But leaving wasn't simple. He called relentlessly that night, his voice shifting from honeyed apologies to threats laced with venom. She didn't answer, but each ring made her body tense. I could see the war raging inside her, the pull of fear, the weight of guilt, the temptation to believe his promises. I stayed beside her, repeating the same words like a prayer. You are strong. You are not alone. This is the right choice. When dawn came, we packed her car with essentials while the children still slept, their small heads resting on pillows in my spare bedroom. She moved like someone in a trance, torn between dread and determination. Before she left for the shelter, she turned to me and broke down again, sobbing into my arms. What if they hate me for taking them away from their father? She whispered. I stroked her hair, holding her as tightly as when she was a child. They will thank you one day for teaching them what strength looks like. They will grow up knowing love is not fear and respect is not control. You're giving them a chance at a better future. She nodded, her tears soaking my shoulder. And then, with a deep breath, she led her children to the car and drove away to the safe house. I stood on the porch long after the taillights had vanished, my heart both heavy and light, heavy with worry about what would come next, light with pride in the courage she had finally summoned. But as any mother knows, the story didn't end there. He did not take her leaving quietly. Within days, he showed up at my house, pounding on the door, demanding to know where she was. His charm was gone, replaced with rage that twisted his face into something almost unrecognizable. I refused to answer, standing in the hallway with my phone in hand, ready to call the police. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, he stormed off, leaving behind a trail of threats muttered under his breath. I knew then that the battle was only beginning. There would be court hearings, custody fights, endless attempts from him to claw back control. But there would also be strength hers, mine, the children's. For the first time, we were no longer in the shadows. For the first time, the truth was out in the open. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, I reflected on how a forgotten pair of glasses had led me here, to this war I never expected to fight again. It felt almost like fate, as though some unseen force had guided me back to that doorstep so I could hear what I was meant to hear. Without that mistake, I might never have known, might never have stepped in until it was too late. Sometimes life turns on the smallest of moments, and from them grow choices that change everything. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: my daughter was no longer alone in the darkness. She had me. She had her children, and she had a future worth fighting for. The weeks that followed tested us more than I could have imagined. Once my daughter and the children settled into the shelter, reality set in. Freedom was not a single step, but a series of exhausting battles, each demanding more resilience than the last. She had to file for a protective order, face lawyers, recount her trauma again and again to strangers in suits who seemed more concerned with paperwork than with the tremor in her voice. Each court date was a storm cloud looming on the calendar. Each encounter with him a reminder of the power he still thought he held. And yet, little by little, I began to see changes in her, subtle at first, like the way her shoulders relaxed when she laughed, or how she started humming while washing dishes in my kitchen. The bruises faded, though the deeper scars would take much longer. And with every passing day, she seemed to rediscover pieces of herself he had tried to erase. The children, too, blossomed in small ways, drawing bright pictures, giggling freely, no longer shrinking at the sound of a raised voice. But he didn't let go easily. He tried manipulation, sending long letters filled with apologies and promises. He tried intimidation, showing up outside the courthouse with glares sharp enough to cut. He even tried to turn the children against her, whispering lies during supervised visits. Every move was designed to break her spirit, to remind her of the control he once had. But my daughter stood firm, even when her hands shook, even when doubt whispered in her ear. She leaned on me, and I leaned on her, and together we built a wall he could not breach. I remembered the night I had first overheard his cruelty, how helpless I had felt pressed against that doorframe. Now, standing beside her in court as she spoke her truth, I no longer felt helpless. I felt proud of her courage, proud of the strength she found within herself, proud to be her mother. There were moments when she faltered, when tears choked her words, but she always found her way back, fueled by the determination to give her children a better life. The legal battles stretched on for months, but slowly, the tide turned in her favor. She gained custody, secured child support, and was granted the protection she needed. He fought bitterly, but with every failed attempt to regain control, his power over her diminished. Eventually, even his anger seemed to lose its sharpness, reduced to distant grumblings that no longer reached her ears. When the final hearing ended and the judge's gavel fell, she collapsed into my arms, sobbing with relief. "It's over," she whispered, though we both knew healing would take longer than any court ruling. Still, it was a milestone, a moment of victory we had fought hard to reach. Life after that was not simple, but it was real. She found a small house not far from mine, modest but filled with warmth. The children decorated their new bedrooms with drawings and posters, their laughter filling the walls. She returned to work, rediscovered friendships she had been forced to abandon, and slowly rebuilt her confidence. Watching her reclaim her life was like watching a flower push through cracked pavement, fragile yet unstoppable. One evening, months later, we sat together on her porch while the children played in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. She turned to me, her eyes soft but steady, and said, "If you hadn't come back that night for your glasses, I don't know where I'd be." The words caught in my throat. I thought back to that night, to the chill of his voice, to the sound of shattering glass, to my own trembling hands on the doorknob. It had felt like an accident then, a meaningless mistake. But sitting beside her now, hearing the laughter of my grandchildren, I realized it had been a turning point. A forgotten pair of glasses had become the key that unlocked the truth, the catalyst for change neither of us had dared to imagine. I squeezed her hand and whispered, "You would have found your strength eventually. You always had it in you, but inside, I knew that sometimes fate intervenes, nudging us toward the truths we most need to face. In the quiet that followed, I reflected on everything we had endured. I thought of the fear, the helplessness, the anger, but also of the resilience, the courage, the love that had carried us through. Life had tested us in ways I never wished for, but it had also reminded me of a truth I had nearly forgotten. We are stronger together than we ever are alone. My daughter's journey is far from over. Healing is not linear, and there are still nights when shadows creep back into her mind. But she is free. She is building a new life for herself and her children, a life rooted in dignity and peace. And I, as her mother, am more grateful than words can express to witness it. Sometimes the smallest moments change everything: a forgotten pair of glasses, a decision to turn back, a choice to listen instead of walking away. Those moments remind us that love is not passive. Love is action, courage, persistence. Love is standing at someone's side, even when they can't stand on their own. And if there is one lesson I carry from this chapter of our lives, it is this: never underestimate the power of being present. You may not have the answers. You may not be able to fix everything, but your presence can be the lifeline someone needs to find their way out of the dark. So to those listening now, if you ever sense someone you love is suffering in silence, don't turn away. Be patient. Be gentle. Be there. You may never know how much it matters, but I promise you, it matters more than you can imagine. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear it. And I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had a small moment that changed everything? Your story might inspire someone else to find their strength too.